Russian forces are pressing in closer to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, on day 2 of a full-scale invasion. The mayor says the city has entered a defensive phase and Ukrainian military vehicles are entering the capital to protect it from approaching Russian troops. Air raid sirens have been sounding in Kyiv and other cities, prompting people to take shelter in metro stations. There have been reports of clashes in and around Kyiv after Russia bombarded the city with missiles overnight. Ukraine's government says at least 137 of its soldiers and civilians have been killed across the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin has claimed he's willing to negotiate after Ukraine's President Zelensky raised the possibility of discussing neutral status for his country. But the conditions for such talks are not immediately clear. Let's join DW correspondent Nick Connolly on the line. He was in Kyiv and, like so many others, has been forced to flee. Welcome, Nick. Can you tell us where you are and what's going on?
So we've just been heading southwest from Kyiv, trying to keep away from fighting, given the kind of unclear pattern of fighting in the geography and the kind of impossibility of trying to predict where things are going to happen. We basically just chose the direction that seemed to be the least likely to see fighting. So we're heading towards the city of Vinnytsia, which is kind of broadly towards Poland and the EU. But even there, we've seen lots of tanks, Ukrainian tanks, heading towards Kyiv to join that fight there. We've seen Russian planes in the sky above us. Lots of people on the roads. Big lines outside petrol stations, people trying to refuel their cars, and checkpoints going up. You really can kind of see the kind of sandbags being piled atop each other, and this is all really in flux. You can tell the kind of local security services really are just in the first hours of this, trying to kind of get a grip on where the fights are going to be, where the fights are going to come from, and what's going to be expected of them.
And people who stayed in the capital, are they just hoping for the best or preparing for an actual invasion?
I think that is no longer an impossibility. I mean, lots of people I know have maybe stayed in here but moved from the city centre to the suburbs, to maybe their weekend houses somewhere, anywhere away from obvious targets like government buildings or military installations. That's definitely a big fear that Russia will try and target basically the kind of central neuralgic points of Ukraine's administration, places where this effort is being planned from. So even office buildings, not necessarily barracks, might be targeted. People trying to move away as possible, far as possible from that. And then again, they face another night in bomb shelters or in metro stations like they had yesterday already. It was kind of obviously terrifying hearing those sirens for the first time, not being able to tell where that shooting is coming from, where those missiles are coming from. We've seen extensive damage to resident buildings in Kyiv yesterday as a result of, as we understand it, missiles. So it's definitely a very fast-moving situation, and one which I guess all the weeks of this was building up. I don't think anyone really expected to be finding themselves.
And President Zelensky is still in the country. How dangerous is the situation for him?
Well, he said that he believes that he is target number one, that the goal of this Russian offensive is to presumably to take his life, or at least to take him prisoner, and then the kind of playbook would be, it's assumed, for Russia to then install its own kind of pocket leadership, its own its own favourites to lead Ukraine, and to then agree some kind of deal that would have Ukraine permanently bound to Russia, and not in NATO and not just neutral, but also far closer in terms of its relationship to Russia, to say Belarus right now, than to other former Soviet countries. So that's a real worry. Very aggressive rhetoric coming out of Moscow as they began this intervention, talking about demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine as part of their strategy to kind of delegitimize Ukraine and say it's some kind of neo-Nazi state, without even bothering to actually explain how they see that and why they would explain that. It's just a kind of claim that's thrown out there to try and create some kind of justification for this, presumably largely back home in Russia, where lots of people are now going out onto the streets and asking why their government is doing this. If it claims that Ukraine is a brotherly neighbour country, why is Russia bombing its closest neighbour without making the case that it seems why this is now happening?
And Nick, lots of people are leaving not just the cities, but the country as well. What are the main routes out?
Well, for now, the main route is to Poland, straight west out of Kyiv towards Lviv, which is the biggest city on the Polish border. But there have been issues today that along some of the main roads leading west, there was fighting. We understand there was fighting between Russian forces, potentially even Russian tanks and the Ukrainian army, just within about 15 kilometers of that main artery leading out. And given the numbers of people out and about, there were very, very long traffic jams, people stuck for hours at a time. So you can imagine the anxiety of being stuck in traffic that's basically parked on the motorway, knowing that shooting and even tank fire is happening within a matter of kilometers of where you are, not being able to move. It's a very difficult situation that sent lots of people trying to travel further away from that fighting, further south, in terrain that is often pretty difficult with potholed roads going endlessly between villages. But we've just been spending the last few hours basically just at about 50 kilometers an hour between villages. There's endless lines of vehicles, all trying to find a way out. For now, people aren't losing their calm. I've been pretty struck by the fact that given how difficult it is even to find fuel, let alone know where to go and how to get there, I haven't seen people panic or raise their voices or push ahead in queues at the petrol stations. So for all the kind of severity and the kind of importance of the situation, people are in some way keeping calm and dealing with the situation as best they can.
Nick, thank you so much for letting us know what's going on. Do try and stay safe. Thank you for now. Nick Connolly in Kyiv, just outside Kyiv, I should say. Well, the situation on the ground is, of course, changing rapidly, and it's difficult to confirm. So let's get more from DW reporter William Glucroft on what we've been able to broadly piece together today.
Yeah, thanks very much. It is indeed very complicated. There's, of course, been air attacks all around the country in major cities all around the country. But want to focus on the land war that is happening right now in major places all around the country. First, let's have the general map of Ukraine. Ukraine between Poland, Belarus, and Russia, and over to the east, the separatist-held part of Ukraine. That's been that way since 2014. There are some key points here. Let's get a closer look now where Russian land forces are coming in from. We see them first coming in from the north through Russia's ally Belarus, the east from Russian bases, Russia proper itself, pushing in through that Russian-backed separatist zone in the Donbas region. And of course, in the south here, we have Crimea. Crimea is a Ukrainian peninsula that Russia in 2014 illegally annexed. There's been a naval base there for quite a long time, and Russia's using that as a point to go into points further south. Now, what exactly is happening in these areas? Let's have a quick look. First of all, of course, all eyes are on Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, the big prize for Russia. They're moving in from the north. We can see from the map how close Kyiv is to Belarus. It's not a long drive for Russian forces to get there. We've been hearing that there's fighting at least in the northern part of the city, possibly moving into the city right now. And the defense ministry, the Ukrainian defense ministry, has said that they want civilians there to stay indoors and prepare Molotov cocktails for possibly fighting those Russian forces as they come in if the Ukrainian military is not strong enough to do it on their own. Now, of course, then we have the east. This is where most Ukrainian forces are because they've been fighting this insurgency, this rebel area. They've been fighting that since 2014. So that's where most Ukrainian forces are. And that's where we see in at least 3 different major points Russian forces coming in from the east and also from the south, from Crimea, as I said, where that Russian naval base is. And we've been seeing amphibious landings, reports of that, from Mariupol and even Odessa, key strategic locations on Ukraine's Black Sea coast. Now, one possibility here, one of the biggest fears is if the troops in the south and the east can link up, they may be able to cut off the Ukrainian forces in the east, get them trapped there so they wouldn't be able to help in the fight in points further west, such as the capital. This is the very perilous situation that Ukraine is facing right now. Of course, Ukraine outmatched and outgunned, but there's a lot we don't know. How long Ukraine can withstand Russian attacks, of course, how much Russia is willing to commit to this fight, and what exactly Russia's end goals are, whether it's simply to give that separatist region over to the separatists in fully, as more so than in 2014, if they're looking to split the country entirely between East and West, and of course, if they want to do complete regime change and occupy the country entirely. It's very, very difficult to say. Very difficult to say where the losses are right now, and of course, very perilous in the days ahead.
All right. William Glucroft, thank you so much for that. All right, now let's get a view of this conflict from one of Ukraine's neighbours. Tomas Hendrik Ilves was the president of Estonia from 2006 to 2016. Welcome to DW. How much of what's happening in Ukraine today is because Western governments underestimated Vladimir Putin?
Well, Western is... Depends which Western governments. First of all, let me just start off by saying that the distance between Kyiv and Tallinn, Estonia, 1,350 kilometers, is exactly the same distance as Berlin to Kyiv. So neighbors, we're both neighbors. But certainly, I would say for a good 20 years, the western part of NATO and the European Union did not take that seriously the Eastern countries' warnings and concerns about the behavior of the Russians, because, of course, their rhetoric as well as their behavior was starkly different.
Right. So some EU countries, including your own, have today decided to send more weapons to support Ukraine. What sort of impact do you think this will have?
Well, it's very difficult to say what the actual weapons, what kind of impact they will have, but certainly it stands in stark contrast to the decision by some other governments to not do anything or send any weapons. And so, of which there are several. So, I mean, I think it certainly provides moral support to the Ukrainians who otherwise feel quite abandoned.
All right, let's talk about Germany's decision then to refuse to send weapons and indeed to stop other countries from sending German weapons. Do you regard that as being a mistake?
Quite. And I find even more bizarre is the rationale that was used for a number of policies. But let's face it, Ukraine was, along with Poland and Belarus, a far greater victim of German aggression during World War II in terms of numbers killed, in the absolute numbers as well as in proportion of the population, than was Russia. So it does strike people who know the history of the bloodlands, as Timothy Snyder called them, to be a somewhat odd decision.
Looking at it from the German point of view, the logic there is that having seen and witnessed and perpetrated those horrors in the past, they're very reluctant to go down, to go anywhere near that path again.
Well, when you read the president, the Bundespräsident, justify Nord Stream 2 by saying that Germany has a special debt to Russia, and therefore must do Nord Stream 2, and it's Ukraine that is against it, among other, inter alia, and also Poland. It does not really wash.
Except that we're in the situation now where Germany has put a stop to Nord Stream 2. So the country is very much getting in line with its allies. I wonder how worried you are there in Estonia about a spillover from this current conflict.
Well, why should we have more of a spillover than anyone else? I mean, I think there's a general spillover that Europe should worry about. But other than that, I think, I mean, we're not direct neighbors, but certainly if Russia is successful, I think it will encourage even more aggressive behavior.
We understand that President Putin has suggested negotiations in Minsk. Can there still be talks with Mr. Putin after what has happened?
Well, that's a decision for President Zelensky to make quite clearly, but I would find it extremely difficult, especially since Belarus is an ally of the belligerent. But, Thucydides said that the strong do what they want and the weak do what they must. So we'll see. I don't really imagine him doing that given the current situation. But on the other hand, I don't have as adequate an overview of how bad it is. I do not think it would find broad support in the Ukrainian public, though, which I think is quite fiercely opposed to caving into Moscow and its rather ridiculous demands.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Thomas Hendrik Ilves, former president of Estonia. Now, if you're just joining us, you might be wondering how relations between former Soviet bloc members deteriorated so quickly. DW reporter Michelle Stockman has taken a look at how Ukraine's westward push, including its desire to join the North Atlantic Military Alliance, NATO has so incensed Russia.
8 years ago, Vladimir Putin had a friend in Kyiv, President Viktor Yanukovych.
Having pro-Russia president was very important for Russia. It meant that a lot of reforms would be stalled. It meant that any union with the West would not be possible.
And in 2013, when Yanukovych refused to sign an association agreement for closer ties to the EU, the people rebelled. Scores died, hundreds were injured in the Maidan Revolution. Yanukovych was ousted, and a new pro-EU government formed. The Kremlin answered back with tanks and annexed Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. Moscow also threw its support behind separatists in the pro-Russia Donbass region. War broke out as the two eastern provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk, declared independence. European leaders brought the two sides together for the Minsk peace accords. But the war ground to a stalemate. A development far from the battlefield also spiked tensions. In June 2015, Russia announced the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Its route under the Baltic Sea would bypass Ukraine, meaning Kyiv would lose billions in transit fees. Another turning point in 2019, with Vladimir Zelensky as Ukraine's president. He vowed to restore the Donbass region and renewed calls for NATO membership.
Many leaders hint slightly that Ukraine shouldn't take the risk of talking constantly about membership of the alliance, because this risk is connected to Russia's reaction.
But that was a red line for Moscow.
And no one thought that if Ukraine creates such threats for Russia, it creates similar threats for herself.
It was one of Putin's justifications for the Russian troop buildup around Ukraine's borders. But unlike 8 years ago, Ukraine is a battle-hardened nation that's vowed to resist.
So let me recap the latest developments for you. Russian forces are closing in on Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, on day 2 of a full-scale invasion. The mayor says the city's entered a defensive phase and Ukrainian military vehicles are entering the capital to protect it from approaching troops. Air raid sirens have been sounding in Kyiv and other cities, prompting people to take shelter in metro stations. There have also been reports of clashes in and around the city after Russia bombarded it with missiles overnight. Ukraine's government says at least 137 of its soldiers and civilians have been killed across the country. Russian President Vladimir Putin claims he's willing to negotiate after Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky raised the possibility of neutral status for Ukraine, but the conditions for such talks are not immediately clear. Now, one of Vladimir Putin's stated reasons for invading Ukraine is the danger of the NATO military alliance coming too close to Russian territory. Now, with war on its doorstep, leaders from the alliance are holding a virtual summit to discuss increasing its presence on its eastern border. NATO comprises 30 countries, with the US the most powerful. If we take a closer look at its European borders, we see the Baltic states of Estonia and Latvia both border Russia, while Lithuania borders Russia's ally Belarus. Troop deployments in Estonia and Latvia are small, at just over 1,000 each, while reinforcements from Germany recently landed in Lithuania. Poland has just over 6,000 troops at the moment, and the member states on the southeastern flank have smaller garrisons. The US is sending reinforcements as the alliance moves to strengthen its eastern edges. Well, a short while ago, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg gave his opening remarks ahead of the virtual summit.
Russia has shattered peace on the European continent. What we have warned against for months has come to pass, despite all our efforts to find a diplomatic solution. Moscow bears sole responsibility for the deliberate, cold-blooded and long-planned invasion. We condemn Russia's aggressions in the strongest possible terms and call on Russia to immediately cease its military action. We stand with the brave people of Ukraine. We fully support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, its right of self-defense, and its right to choose its own path.
Well, as the Russian military besieged the Ukrainian capital, Moscow has said it will topple the Ukrainian government. The mayor of Kyiv has announced that the defense of the city has begun. Thousands of civilians have fled. Those who remain are braced for a violent confrontation.
Another terrifying start to the day in Kyiv. Overnight, there was more destruction. Bombs rained down, forcing residents to flee to safety in bunkers. Metro stations and cellars, packed with residents, grappling to come to terms with their new reality. It's hard, but I'm holding on. A nearby house caught fire, and there were many victims. And we were waiting until 7 o'clock in the morning in our apartment, in the corridor, in the bathroom, until the end of curfew, so that we could come here. I work here. I feel mostly tired and anxious. It's so strange. None of it feels real. I don't even know how to relate to it all. Above them, soldiers on the streets of central Kyiv, and reports of gunfire near the government district. And on the edge of the capital, an enemy aircraft the Ukrainian army claims they shot down. Meanwhile, Ukraine's president sent a message to Russia. Russia will have to talk to us sooner or later. Talk about how to end the fighting and stop this invasion. The sooner the conversation begins, the fewer losses there will be for Russia itself. But in Moscow, repeated unfounded claims from the Kremlin suggest there's no end to Russia's invasion in sight. The aim of the operation was openly declared: demilitarization and denazification. We want the Ukrainian people, or as President Putin said, all the people living in modern Ukraine, to have the opportunity to freely determine their future destiny. But for most Ukrainians, the only future they're contemplating now is whether to remain in their homeland or to flee.
Well, European Union leaders have agreed new sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, but they held back from cutting it off from the global SWIFT payment system, following resistance from countries including Germany. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen says the measures agreed would have a major impact on the Russian economy.
We will hold the Kremlin accountable. The package of massive and targeted sanctions European leaders approved tonight clearly demonstrates that. It will have maximum impact on the Russian economy and the political elite, and it is built of 5 pillars. The first is the financial sector. Second, the energy sector. The third is the transport sector. Fourth are export controls and the ban of export financing. And finally, visa policy.
Well, let's hear now from Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She's the leader of the opposition in Belarus, which borders Ukraine, which has been, Belarus, which has been allied with Russia in its assault. She was forced into exile by the country's autocratic leader, Alexander Lukashenko. And welcome to DW. Can we start with your reaction to the events of the last couple of days?
Yesterday in the morning, of course, we woke up in new reality. We didn't expect this war would happen. We didn't believe in this. But we see that illegitimate regime made Belarus the country aggressor. Putin partnered with Lukashenko and attacked Ukraine. And this is the price Lukashenko is paying for Kremlin support in 2020, which allowed Lukashenko to stay in power. So I really want to express solidarity with all Ukrainians. Belarusian people don't want to fight, especially they don't want to fight against Ukraine, our neighbor, people we love, and we want to be friends, of course, with them.
It's hard. I mean, what do you base that on? Because we here in the West, we hear the narrative that is coming out of the Kremlin. We hear the narrative from the Kremlin talking about denazification, talking about a genocide against Russian people. This is the same story that Russians are hearing. So if that's what they're hearing, what makes you so sure they don't want a war?
Our people in the 21st century have to realize the situation by themselves and not to follow propaganda messages, because people in any country can decide their future for themselves, and they want to use their language. They want to live peacefully in their countries. And look, I'm communicating with Ukrainians. Nobody complained that Ukrainian government abusing them or whatever. And of course, this narrative, this message is sent by Russia doesn't have anything to, nothing real.
And part of Russia's attack has been launched from military bases in your country, Belarus. Is Vladimir Putin in complete control of the country?
We see that illegitimate regime can't control situation anymore. Lukashenko lost his legitimacy in 2020, and now he is selling our country to Kremlin. He's like a huge aircraft carrier for Russia. Belarus provides its territory, infrastructure, military facilities to Russia, and the Belarusian air defense system is serving to Russian missile and fight attack.
And I know that you've called on members of the Belarus military not to participate in Russia's war. What sort of response have you had?
I know that majority of Belarusian people don't support this war, don't support the participation of Belarusian army in this war. Only 12% believe that Belarus must send its soldiers, and only 13% in support of Russian campaign. 56% believe Belarus must stay neutral. And I hope that people in nomenclatura and in army understand this as well, and they will not fulfill criminal orders of the regime.
Right. There was a lot of criticism of Western governments for not supporting you enough and the opposition enough when the regime in Belarus cracked down on the pro-democracy movement that you lead. There's a lot of the same criticism now when it comes to supporting Ukraine. I wonder how you feel. Is the West failing Eastern Europe?
Actually, I'm grateful to European Union for united position about Belarus, and I saw a lot of sympathy and solidarity with Belarusian people. But actually, the first strong package of sanctions have been imposed in 10 months after crackdown of Belarusian uprising, and of course it's too late. And I think that half measures only harm in this situation, and I'm sure that much more could be done towards Belarusian regime, and much more can be done now to support Ukraine.
Well, and just on that, with so much of the world's attention now focused on Ukraine, I wonder, do you worry that Belarus's fight for democracy will get forgotten?
Fight for democracy will never be forgotten, and moreover, as Belarus is a part of this aggression, of course, it will be interconnected with this crisis in Ukraine. And moreover, while all the attention is on this Ukrainian-Russian crisis, very important events are going on in Belarus. You know that this Sunday we are going to have so-called referendum launched by illegitimate regime. And what is very concerned about this referendum, that Lukashenko is going to amend our constitution, and the paragraph about neutrality and non-nuclear status of our country is deleted. So Belarus became a threat for European security, because Lukashenko is unpredictable, and next day after this so-called constitution is adopted, Russian nuclear weapon can be on the territory of Belarus.
It's a sobering thought. Thank you so much for joining us, Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya.
Thank you.